Edit profile. No, it's profile picture.
Well,
Does
the one
anybody
thing I can
notice
tell you
the-
is that Zoom and Google keep changing the rules every week.
Does anybody have Microsoft Teams on an iPhone?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, there was an OS update, and in the process of that, they removed a very important function in Microsoft Teams. It's called quiet hours.
Just put it in the ice box. You'll never know it, Ryan.
Yeah,
Huh?
I can manually take it offline, which I usually do at night anyway, since I'm not on call. But I just don't know whether to blame Microsoft or Apple for that.
Oh my goodness.
When I join, it asks if I will permit Barry to have total control.
What do you think? I'm going to be a dictator?
I know it says something about you can turn on and off microphones and cameras and check my refrigerator.
You did not know that you were signing into the Twilight Zone, did you?
Say, Barry, I've got a question about this meeting.
Hi, Eric.
How are you today?
I am doing fine, thanks. Hope you're as well.
I'm doing all right. When I came into this meeting, I got a notice that it was being live streamed, which I know. But I'm trying to help my dad is a citizen of a little tiny village in St. Louis County, and the city council is trying to figure out how to stream their meetings. And I said, well, you can put them on Zoom, but I didn't realize that there was some possible setup with Zoom to send it to YouTube or something. Is that, do you have to have a special Zoom account for that?
No, you
Configuration.
sign up. You sign up for it, and you can. I forgot the exact mechanism because it's 3 years in the past right now.
But you think it's inside your Zoom account?
As I remember, it is.
Okay, I'll research it a little more and turn them on to it, because I'm 1,000 miles away anyway, so I can't do it for them, but I can say, well, if you go here, you can get the directions.
But you
Yeah,
also have to have a YouTube account.
Right. Well, the city would have to sign up for a YouTube account, which is, not that big of a deal. Matter of fact, learning this also tells me, Chapter 37 has a YouTube account, and we do Zoom our meetings, but it might be nice to also have the Zoomed meeting carried on the YouTube channel, because then, it would be another method. But the other thing that I think would be helpful is, our Zoom account only allows 100 Zoom connections, whereas the YouTube, if you didn't want to participate in the meeting, you just wanted to see it, you wouldn't count against the 100 if you would just take it off of YouTube. So
That's
There may-
unclear.
there
That's
may be some
unclear.
usefulness.
Yeah, it used to be that they would count the YouTube. I don't know what it's doing right now. But-
Okay, well, it's good to know, because in this case, I can do the research. I did not realize that the Zoom could be the medium for getting to YouTube.
Mhm.
So I'll figure it out.
If you have any problems, get back to me later today, and I'll see if I can dig it out.
Okay, well, I'm gonna research it, and then I'm gonna send it back to the little city in Missouri, and they have apparently started looking into all these things. So I want to basically pass it to the people who are going to actually have to do it, lest I become, as Ed Schwartz would say, the person who knows how to backflush the pool filter.
Yeah.
Ed worked at a pool when he was a youth, and he told me that he intentionally never learned how to backflush the filter, because then he would never be asked to backflush the filter.
The hardest part is getting the right passcodes and stuff lined up. But once you do that, it's easy.
Thanks. I will look into it.
Okay. Well, I see we have our international contingent here. Hi, Jeff. And Frank is online now. Hi, Frank.
Hi, Barry and group.
How are you doing today, sir?
I'm doing all right. How about you?
You know, for having everything else going on, to see you up, I'm better.
Well, if there's been something going on, Barry, I was unaware of it, but hopefully, things are moving in the right direction.
Yeah. The only thing would make it better is if we were sitting on your train.
Well, can't complain. And the weather back here has been very amenable for that. So
Oh, we're gonna do that sometime, just set it up.
you know what, we could do that. We a few years ago, a group that I'm involved with, we did something out at one of the railroads where it was about 100 people that came from all over the country, and we streamed it live, and where for like 2 days you could see trains running and people talking. That could be done without any problem.
Wow. That would be nice. That would be nice. Well, we still have folks popping in here on Zoom and on YouTube. Not a whole bunch of news this week, other than what I mentioned on the newsletter about Houston. There seems to be a little bit of controversy as to how high the helicopter was. It was reported in the newspaper as 600 feet, but somebody sent me a readout from, I guess, the radar. It said it was at 900 feet. At any rate, running into that tower at 110 miles an hour, that created a real problem. And
Yeah, Barry, I'm not sure if you're on the Broadcast Engineers Facebook group, but I got something today from the engineer of one of the stations that was
Yeah.
on that tower. He's having difficulty getting his backup transmitter, his backup site happy. He's got an HT35 that now he has discovered has high reflective power from the IPA to the PA. So there's also help being requested.
well, I hate to sound like a Luddite, but I almost never go onto Facebook. It unfortunately a waste of time most of the time. Dana Popolo, though, checked in with him. He's Univision in Boston, and he told me that the two stations were on about half power on an auxiliary stick. But yeah, an auxiliary transmitter could well run into problems after it gets up for a few minutes.
Well, most of the people suggested, and I think it's probably wise, your reflected power back into the IPA does depend on that transmitter in the condition of the final tube.
Mm-hmm.
And they said, you may want to try a known good tube before you start tearing into an actual problem, because it may just be that tube is sat there and got gassy since you never use it.
Yeah. Yeah.
In this day and age, I wonder how many guys have the opportunity or the time to exercise the backup transmitters. I realize I'm showing my age here, but at least once every couple of weeks, I would try to pull a night where I'd go out to the transmitter and throw the backup rig on the air for 10, 15 minutes, just to exercise the doggone thing, so that things don't happen. Because I saw the same post on Facebook, and I was wondering, when was the last time the thing ran, or if you just ran it into the dummy load for a while.
Yeah. Well, the discussion we had a couple of weeks ago there in Atlanta, that transmitter site where some invaders came in, decided to camp out in there and build a meth lab. And I actually contacted one of their group supervising engineers who, let's just say, has not gotten back to me. That old story you hear all the time. But one thing we do know is that the local engineer had not been to that site for at least 4 months, perhaps 6 months.
Wow.
And that to me is just unacceptable. But we keep hearing about these chains and clusters and consolidators that
Yeah, get
have
some
an-
cameras at least in the building,
Yeah.
something.
something. Solid state transmitters don't need the attention that tube guys do.
No, I get that. I get that.
But you cannot leave. I mean, let's face it, a mouse or a spider or bigger animal than that can burrow its way in. You could get a leak in the roof.
Or
And
or you get a bushing going bad in a blower motor and the, motor freezes up and you got all kinds of problems.
absolutely, absolutely. And so I don't have a lot of respect for companies who they push their guys not to do a regular maintenance run. It really is important.
I can tell you, and this came from my mentor, Jim Somich, when I was 22 years old. He used to tell me, he'd say, get used to what the ambient sound of the room was like the moment you walk in the building. And there were a couple times I'd walk in the building and I knew something was wrong because, like a blower didn't sound right or something was rattling and was able to, catch a problem before it became a real problem.
Yep, Paul Kriegler over here on YouTube says even our solid state transmitter with 26 hours on it as a backup lost its combiner, and there was a new transmitter born with a smoking problem. So, these things need to be checked.
That's right.
Generators, auxiliary transmitters, auxiliary methods of getting audio to the transmitters, all out there. Maybe we'll launch into that just a little bit here. One other thing I want to mention before we get started, and I read a thing this week, and I have the link here if somebody wants it. There are apparently ways to take any Windows 10 computer and make it a Windows 11 computer going around the Microsoft check. And apparently, there are very few people finding a problem with doing that. Your mileage may vary, but that's the story.
I did that, and it was free.
Yeah, it is. It's a free deal.
But why would you want to?
And the 11's a lot better than 10.
Mm,
There are a few problems with 11 that I've noticed. For instance, the Windows E does not bring the Explorer up anymore. There are things like that. But there are some improvements. And again, when you're talking about end of life, end of support for antivirus and things like that, there will come a point here when you want to be on 11 no matter what, and you don't want to buy a new computer. So anyway, let me just mute all the background things here. Frank, I need to unmute you, and we'll get started. Where are you? There you are. Okay. It is always a pleasure when Frank Foti gives us some time. Some of the best moments of my NAB experiences have been in his booth talking to him. And some of the other great moments have been when he has come around to talk with us. And so I'm really pleased, and I know everybody here is anxious to hear, Frank, what you think about the state of audio processing, what you guys are doing, and what's ahead.
Well, first of all, Barry, it's always a pleasure to sorry guys, it's like you get in a meeting and then all of a sudden the phone and the text start, they go into interrupt mode. Sorry, my apologies. But it's always a pleasure to be a guest with your group, and I always welcome the time when we're able to just, connect and catch up at trade shows and things of that nature. Given that, you know, in our little world here, we always have stuff going on. You know, what the main efforts that have been coming out of, you know, our activities has been focusing on being able to get our products, processing related and others, into the cloud. And we've successfully done that. Last year, we introduced a product known as Forza, which was predominantly set up for streaming. And now this year, we introduced the FM version of that, which has gotten off to a great start. Just so that everybody knows, let's say our Dancing with the Stars, if you will, into the software or the cloud domain was not necessarily just taking the products that we had in the rack and porting that code over. In some cases, we've taken pieces and parts from Omni 11 and a few others and use that as the building blocks or the framework for what we've done. But I will say that the team, and I'm proud of the team that we have, because, you know, when Cutting Edge, which led into becoming Omnia, started, it pretty much was me doing everything with respect to algorithms and, you know, processing and the products in general. Now it's become a real team. Many of you probably are aware that for a lot of time, Cornelius Gould has been very involved with us. And while Corny has been doing a lot of work on his own and along with our friends over at Angry Audio, you know, he and I still put our heads together from time to time to commiserate on things having to do with processing and who knows what may or may not end up in a final product. That being said, I also want to give a shout out to another one of our developers, a young man by the name of Rob Dye. And Rob, along with Jim Kuzman and feedback from Paul Kriegler and my Italian brother from another mother, Max Pandini, they put their heads together and they came up with a lot of the basis of what is in the Forza products. And to Rob's credit, Rob, who's basically been in the background working directly with myself and Corny in getting our designs into the final form factor that would be code-based if it was DSP or embedded. Rob, whose background is audio and acoustics, came forward with some ideas for AGC and dynamic limiting that we incorporated into the Forza product. And one of the things that's really cool about that is that there's a, let's say, an operational framework to the algorithms where the algorithms are able to have an understanding of the dynamics coming in, and as such are able to make adaptations so that the signal can minimize itself with respect to what I call processing annoyances. You know, I'll define that in a bit because there's a topic I want to address in a little bit here. But the goal that we've always had is how do we generate a competitive signal for broadcasting or webcasting, yet minimize what sounds like annoyances to the ear. And that could be anything from harmonic distortion, intermod distortion, pumping, things that just, you know, don't add up well, you know, if you're understanding what I'm talking about. And Rob has accomplished that with some of the algorithm work that he put into Forza, and along with you know, most of my work, believe it or not, has continued to be in the back end, you know, the final limiting section. And to that effect, I'm, you know, matter of fact, our people are nipping at my heels because I guess the call for papers for NAB is coming up, and I'm debating whether or not to put an abstract together. But I spent some time working on something that I've always had a combination of interest in and felt as a need. And this is in the area of what we'll commonly know as intermodulation distortion. One of the things that we deal with in signal processing, especially now that we're in the numeric world digitally, is, the ear can be affected by one of three types of distortion. The worst, one of the worst of which is aliasing distortion. And that falls into algorithmic development, that if you try to have a sampling rate that's too low, or you're generating harmonics that are beyond the Nyquist frequency, they're going to come folding back into the audio as aliasing products. And that's a form of distortion that you definitely don't want to have. And it's as nasty as harmonic distortion, which is, just clipping the daylights out of something to the point of where the audio sounds broken, if you will. The last piece, and it's more of a subjective quotient, if you will, is what we refer to as intermod distortion. And intermod distortion can show up in a couple of ways in signal processing. Probably the easiest description I can give you guys is, think back of taking, let's say, some of the older analog products, and this is not a knock on analog or really any processor, where you could get access to the attack and release times. If you start running stuff really fast and drive the audio, let's say 10 dB or more, you'll have a control signal develop that is going to be operating almost at the speed of the audio. And what that means is that the control signal is going to intermodulate the audio signal. So while that's happening, you're going to say, well, what does that mean? What do I hear? That's the aspect where how many times have you listened to audio where it just sounds really smashed or dense or packed up, where transients are like totally sucked out? That's intermod distortion. Now, in a dynamic section like a compressor or limiter, and if you have access to the attack and release times, predominantly release, you slow it all down, smooths it out, and you go, that's great. The challenge becomes is in the back end, the final limiter. There too you can end up with intermod distortion. The most common one is our bass low frequencies, where the wavelength is so long that during that wavelength period, while it's into the clipper, guess what? It's taking the rest of the spectrum into the clipper with it as well. So in effect, what you have is an intermodulation happening within the clipper, and that's where you'll end up hearing the mids and presents and highs start to get that smeary, smashed sounding, and sometimes a bit of a tearing sound. Well, I'm giving all this description because I spent a fair amount of time this summer working on ways to minimize or eliminate that. And in doing so, what the end result is audio that retains the competitive edge that you're looking for. And group, I'm not going to sit here and talk about loudness, because that's a whole other debate. That's a whole other topic. But I also know that, people on the radio that, I can't tell you how many times people say, Frank, that sounds really good. I need it to be another dB louder, what have you. And I'm not trying to go there, but knowing that, the marketplace, they want a competitive sound. There are ways to minimize or suppress the intermod distortion that can happen in final limiters and in the dynamic sections. So from my world, that's predominantly where a lot of my effort has been spent, and it'll hopefully see the light of day within the next year or so, as Santa's little elves are busy at work here, here at Omnia and within the Telos Alliance. So
May I ask a question?
Oh, yes, please. I was going to say, I'll stop there, and if people have questions or there's directions you guys want me to take the discussion, I'm happy to go there.
Oh, great. The question I want to ask right now, you're talking about the work that you've done, and you talk about loudness. if you would, just for a few minutes, the difference between 125 and 99 and 115 and 94, let's say, or pick any pair of numbers you like. How big a difference is that really going to be on the air and through the modern radios?
Or you're talking about modulation levels.
Yes, sir.
Well, I mean, think about it. As I look at the mod monitor here in my office, if somebody's sitting at 125% modulation and another guy's sitting at 100% modulation, that's almost a 2 dB difference. Now, that said, as I'm speaking to you unprocessed, if I was to shift my voice by 2 dB, you're not going to hear much in level. But what's going into that transmitter is pretty compressed. I mean, even if it's heavily processed or not. So you shift something by 2 dB, you can hear the difference. And one of the things that when I say we, excuse me, one of the things that we, and by we I mean myself, Leif, have done was we came up with this method of embedding the pilot, which allows the audio legally to be always at 100% modulation included with the pilot. That's 1 full dB. That's why we have this thing called 1 louder, because it's 1 dB louder than conventional processed audio, where the audio is at 90% and the pilot takes up the other 10%. So to answer your question, Barry, if somebody's at 125 and somebody's at, say, 95, there's probably about a 2.5 dB difference in loudness there, and that's perceptible.
But if you're at 125 and 120, or on FM you're at 110 and 105,
That's about this.
the listener's not going to know the difference.
No, but the story that I've shared in the past, and I'll share it again. When back in '83, when I was working at Z100 with Scott Shannon.
I want to talk to you about that. A little bit of history, but forgive me. Give me a moment here, because it's very appropriate that today our program is being sponsored by Broadcast Depot, and son of a gun, their special right now is the Omnia processors, and I think that's about as convenient as you can get.
I would say so.
And so I just want to take a moment. Mary is with us, of course, but you're here, and we have all these things, the Omnia 9, which you mentioned, Leif, the Omnia Volt, which I don't know if that's the one that we want to talk about with Corny, but I really got my mind into this 11 and the fact that the screen is so large and your diagnostics are so much more available and here we go back to maintaining and looking at your transferring and seeing what's going on, and I'd like to get to that, but let's go back to the little history here. You got started and audio has been your passion for a long time.
Oh yeah, I recently gave a talk at my high school. This year has been the 50th. That is the 50th year of my graduating class, and I gave my senior project in physics was bringing my audio amplifier in that I built, which was a Heathkit AR-1500, which I still have and still works. Yes, I've recapped it numerous times. And I, went through the whole explanation as to how it worked. And I will say that, audio has always been something that has mattered to me. Back in the day, in fact, the fellow was one of my better friends in high school. We used to sit in class and debate the specifications between, a Shure V15 phonograph cartridge up against an Ortofon or something like that, and elliptical and conical styluses and things of that nature. So yes, audio has always been very important to me, and I really started to lock into it and focus in on it when I went to work at WHK and WMMS in Cleveland in 1978. And that's where I, met up with the gentleman who became my mentor in this industry, and it was also a great set of ears. And Barry, I know you did a lot of work with him, Jim Somich, who has passed on. And it was Jim who sat me down one day, and Jim crafted a nickname that has stuck with me to this day. He took my last name, which is Foti, and he stretched it out and to the point of being Foti. And he'd say, Foti, you're gonna learn how to listen to the radio like you never listened to it ever before in your life. And boy, was he right. And so, historically, Jim and I learned a lot. But the over-the-air sound of both WMMS on FM and WHK on AM meant the world to us. I mean, we put our hearts and souls into it, and I've just carried that forward. I took this interest in this, black magic called audio processing, and back in my younger years, I would I would take the manuals home of anything I could find and study them and read them and figure out and have an understanding as to why circuits were done a certain way, and insofar as being able to create dynamic compressors and limiters, and then starting to really want to understand how the final limiter, the whole, not only just the clipping, but to be able to manage distortion created by clipping. So yeah, it's Barry, the best thing I can say is it's in my blood as much as steam oil, coal, and soot and cinders are in my blood.
Well, I like that. I like that a lot. And I remember when you I didn't know you in Cleveland. I got to know Jim, and what a great guy, and his articles and I've got them posted on the BDR. About audio processing. When you look into what he's talking about, a lot of it makes sense. And as I remember, as you sequenced into New York and started really to get into the first really production processors that you made, I found that they were really loud. I think you and Ron Jones were sort of almost in a foot race for that recognition, but you were clean, and this was something that Mike DeRoe and Bob Orban, they were more interested in fidelity. They were not interested. Yes, they had to put some loudness in because otherwise nobody would buy their boxes. But you were the one that really got to where a station could sparkle off the dial.
Well, Barry, thank you for saying that. And, I learned a lot in New York. Obviously, I still call it the Super Bowl of markets here in the United States. And I'll never forget, before we had Z100 on the air, I was sitting in a hotel. We were all staying at the time it was known as the Meadowlands Hilton. And the nice thing about being in the Meadowlands in Jersey was there's virtually no multipath out there because it's all flat. And I remember sitting in the hotel room, and I had headphones and a table radio, and I'm scanning the dial. And I remember thinking, oh my God, I feel like my ears are being fused together. And while a lot of the guys that worked in many of those stations have since become friends of mine and customers, we'll leave some call letters nameless, but you'll be able to figure out whom. I remember thinking, we've got to come up with a way to compete with these guys, yet we need to stand out on the dial. And the short story is that earlier that summer or that year, I'd been at NAB and I saw the Texar, what were the Texar audio prisms, and had talked to, Glenn Clark. And I thought, and at the same time, because I was living in San Francisco and was good friends with Jesse Maxench from Orban, and I knew Bob. And I know that Bob was working on what became the XT 2 chassis. They had it on K101 in San Francisco. And when we put Z100 on the air, all we had was, you guys might laugh at this. All we had was a barefoot 8100 because the station had been prior WVNJ. So we added a composite clipper, made it a little louder, but it did not have that, top 40 sound. And I remember Scott was, it was driving him crazy. And so I called out to California and asked if, I said, look, I'm at this brand new radio station in New York City. We need to do something, and wondering if you guys have another prototype of this multi-band chassis, which was a modified 9100 to get the 6 bands. And Jesse said, Frank, Bob would like to help you, but he doesn't like to let prototypes outside of an area where he can't hear them. So I figured, okay, that's done. So I reached out at the time to Allied Broadcast to see if I could get a pair of these prisms to try. And true story, group, I made the call about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. About 10 minutes later, I get a phone call from Glenn Clark himself. He said, he goes, I understand you want to try a pair of these. I said, yep. He said, is this New York City? I said, yep. He said, well, he goes, I'm holding a ticket on Allegheny Airlines in about an hour and a half. If you could pick me up at the Newark airport, we'll have them on the air tonight. And I went over to Newark, picked up Glenn. He had them stuffed in a suitcase, and we put them on the air that night. And the next morning, I remember Scott Shannon saying to me, Franco, because Scott has his own nickname for me, which was Franco. He said, Franco, whatever you're doing, Z100 sounds loud and proud. And that's what began it. We had a set of prisms, the 8100, a composite clipper, and I had an EXR exciter, which was, an offshoot of the Aphex Oral exciter to give it some sparkle. And then we had that for a number of years, Barry. And then as everyone else kind of figured out what we were doing, I then started to realize I got to start hot rodding stuff. And that's when I got into doing stuff on my own. And, that's when at this point, if the group has interest in the story, Glenn at the time had a prototype of what became the replacement Card 5 for the Optimon. And we did the testing on Z100, and it sounded great. And Glenn called up one day and said, look, I need you to FedEx that thing back because we need to test it up against the first run of the cards, and we'll get you a card, as soon as we get these done. I figured, okay. Well, in the meantime, Emmis launched Hot 103.5, which had a Greg box on the air. And boy, that changed everything. And my backup at that time was we had an Aphex Dominator in the rack. And I started saying to myself, every time I lean on the Dominator, it gets too busy. It goes back to that definition of intermod that I gave earlier. So that's when I started, hot rodding stuff on my own. I didn't even have a schematic. I just one night sat there with, took the unit off the air and had the backup processing on during the overnights and started poking around the oscilloscope to determine where the attack and release resistors were and how the thresholding all worked. And one thing led to another, and I started modifying stuff and put that on the air. And that's how the product that later became known as the Vigilante was born. It was born at Z100.
That's fascinating. I think in that time period, a lot of engineers were experimenting. I know that we had moved from the sped up Automax Volumax, the Max brothers, into the early Optimods and the Texars and of course things like that. But as you said, as these things started to settle in, the stations all started to sound very similar, and you needed a way to stand out on the dial.
Oh yeah. And actually, an interesting tidbit to this story, and any of you guys out there who know Greg Oganowski, please feel free to ask him about this, because there's an interesting this all happened before I came up with the modified Dominator. Steve Church, another tremendous individual who's, up in broadcast heaven. Steve was working at the same company I was, which was Mallright Communications. And Steve, and who's a, old friend with Greg, they go back to their radio days in Detroit. Steve had called up and he said, "Hey, I got this box from Greg. I have it on WMMS. Why don't you come to Cleveland? I want you to hear it." So I did, and it was a modified Greg AM, the 2350, and it had been modified to use cards 8 and 9 from the Optimod, and it sounded amazing. Well, Steve, talking to Greg, we had initially created what was going to be a nice little deal where we were going to have Greg build us a bunch of those boxes as an exclusive for Mallright. We're going to put them on all the Mallright stations. So Greg is building these, and Mallright, in their infinite wisdom, which probably parallels that of the current ownership of the Cleveland Browns, if you guys get my sarcasm there, Mallright management came and said that they were cutting budgets and that we didn't have, they were cutting the funds for us to have those boxes. Well, Steve had to deliver this bad news to Greg, who's now on the hook for these things personally. And it was at that time that Emmis had purchased 105.9 in Los Angeles, which had been owned by Doubleday, as well as 103.5 in New York, which had been owned by Doubleday. And one of these boxes was on Los Angeles. Well, when they went in there, like, wow, this thing sounds amazing. And Greg said, "If you want, I'll make you a deal." And that's how all those boxes ended up at Emmis. They ended up there because it came out of an idea that Steve Church and I had, and we were going to do with Greg for Mallright. And Mallright, and their, excuse my language, and their infinite stupidity, ticked off Greg, and those boxes ended up competing with us. And that's what drove me to build what became the Vigilante.
It's interesting. You can't ever count on some of these people that have control to really think things through beyond the bottom line.
Well, and you know what, Barry? I remember when it happened because, even though Greg has had a long career with Orban and they're a competitor, Greg and I have always been friends, like good friends. When we see each other, we go out, we'll go get some iced tea or, catch up. Matter of fact, one year a box showed up here in Cleveland and had a whole bunch of little HO trains that came from Greg's parents' home because he wasn't going to use them anymore. And I remember at the time feeling bad because, something that was out of my control and Steve's control was going to, do something that wasn't the best for someone that we knew. And the fact that it came back around to bite Mallright in the where, although I was able to fend it off on my own, I remember thinking, man, that's just not a way to do business. So,
no. To give Greg his due, he's always been cutting edge.
Without question. And it was Greg, Greg, I've teased him about this. I remember hearing there was low end on Hot 103.5 like I'd never heard before.
Yep.
Oh, like I'd never heard before. And the song that they were playing was Higher Love by Stevie Winwood. And if any of you guys, matter of fact, it's sitting right here because I use it to this day to test algorithms. And about 30 seconds into the song, the drums hit and then the bass hits. And I heard bass come over the radio like thinking, oh my God. And I remember talking to Greg about it, and Greg he said, Frank, he goes, I'll tell you what that is. He goes, it's a shelving equalizer, and it's a shelving equalizer that not only does it boost the lows, but it naturally carves out a little bit of a notch around 150 hertz. And I remember thinking, man, Greg, you don't want to be telling me that because, guess what I went and did? I went and, got out my, how many of you guys have on your shelf the Op Amp cookbook, and schemed together some EQ circuits of my own. And, and then that ended up into the processing system as well. So, but yes, when it came to, or I shouldn't say came, when it comes to stuff of that nature, filter design, timing, and processing, I will, I'll be the first to say, Greg's right up there. I mean, if there needs to be a Mount Rushmore of guys with, an audio processing, Greg Ogonowski needs to be on it.
At
The
some point,
best processor I ever heard was a Greg Labs that was my competition in Dallas, where Greg lived at the time. And I would look at that station on the mod monitor, and the meter went from 85 to 100 and never got out of that range. But when you listen to it, it was as open as it could be.
Yep. And a lot of that comes down to what I was talking about before. If you're able to design algorithms where you're able to manage intermod and get everything just right, you'll get that. That's why, I know there's the whole thing about, over compression, hyper compression and the loudness wars, this, that, or the other thing. And I get it, but I also know that there are ways to deliver competitive sound that can sound good. I mean, we've been doing it for many years. Now, again, I want to say, I'm not saying that to promote that style of processing. I'm saying that the capabilities are out there. But yes, Greg's always been, top notch.
I think, what was it, Ron Jones that put an 11 on his knob at one point, turn it up to 11 sort of thing, because that's what some people would do. And yeah, I mean, I've seen stations where they'll run through a decent audio processor, and they'll chase it with one of yours as an example. And all too often, you talk about getting a very pressed sound on the air. That's what can happen very easily if people don't pay attention to what they're doing.
Barry, you're right. And the thing I want to share with everybody is that if I dial it back 40 years, where I'm at Z100 and we were competing obviously with WPLJ. Electrically, WPLJ was probably electrically louder than Z100. But to the ear, Z100 was louder. Why? Because when you crank something up to be super dense, the ear will get desensitized. Whereas if you have some dynamics in there, the ear doesn't become as desensitized. And here's the analogy, and you can do this the next time you go in the bathroom. Turn the hot water key on and let the water get really, really hot. Then take your finger, and if you stick your finger under the hot water and keep it there for the first few seconds, it's going to be hot. But then as the nerves desensitize, it's not hot anymore. Well, now, if you do that, take another finger and then pulse it against the hot water. Every time you hit the hot water, it's going to seem hot. It's the same thing with the ear. And that's what we did with Z100. And the thing I'll share with you, so that I don't want everyone to think that, well, the Z100 processing was only Frank. Scott obviously wanted the thing to burn a hole on the dial. And he never would, to his credit, he would never come in and go, Franco, it's not loud enough. What Scott did, because he would say that he knew that his hearing had probably shifted, he used to have his DJ buddies and DJ program directors who used to come in and do guest shots on the weekend on the radio station. And I can honestly tell you that every one of them would usually go out to dinner with Scott and his wife and say, man, Scott, processing on this radio station is killer. And then Monday, Scott would come in and say, Franco, station sounds amazing. Mark Driscoll was here on over the weekend. He thinks it's the greatest. And, you name it. Back in the 80s, all the big name CHRPDs that Scott was friends with at one time or another did some, unknown DJ fill-in slot on the radio station. And they all would, unbeknownst to me, basically, go to Scott and say, Frank, station sounds amazing. And it was because we tried to have that dynamic punch that printed well on the air. And it goes back to, Barry, what you were saying about being able to have a level of quality, yet the competitive level at the same time.
Yeah. About the same time you're talking about, I think, is when Potomac Instruments came out with that meter that could
Yep, the Quantoral.
registered dynamic range.
Yeah, the Quantoral. Yep.
One of the New York stations, probably PLJ, was somewhere under 0.5 dB dynamic range.
I
And
mean, they had it cranked up. Uh, they had it cranked up pretty good, and that was the direction that their program director Larry Berger wanted, and I was at the time I was married, and my wife, she hated being in the car with me because not 20 seconds would go by that I wasn't going back and forth between 100.3 and 95.5. It's almost like I needed to know that every moment of modulation, we were beating the pants off them. I mean, that's just how it was.
now, over the years, the succeeding generations of the Optimod and the Omnia made major changes. And I think, and check me if I'm wrong, that between you and Corny and Leif, especially when that Omnia 9 came along, which was what a commercial version of what Leif had demonstrated in Amsterdam. Wow. You got into that clipping cancellation and other things that were not just delay lines, but actively correcting the audio.
Well, yes, and one of the things that we've done a lot of work in, like I said, is in the back end, and being able to identify what signals can cause trouble and either suppress them or minimize them, as well as now intermod is where the magic is. And one of the things that we're able to do, by doing everything numerically in the digital domain is, the things I'm about to share with all of you, we're only pipe dreams. I mean, now we're able to take a look at the signal in the frequency domain. And within the frequency domain, there's a whole host of things that you can accomplish that are literally impossible to do in the analog domain. I mean, when you say the frequency domain, what do you mean? Well, when you have an audio signal, we can look at it in the time domain, which is like sine waves, or in the frequency domain, where we've actually broken things out into bins of frequencies. The common function that does this is called an FFT, fast Fourier transform. And once you have it in the frequency domain, the rules change. Now, that said, you might think, oh, well, okay, are we going to get a free lunch? Well, I wish I could say yes, but everything has an Achilles heel, okay? And the FFTs have their own, let's say, quotient of sound, if you will. The most common would be, FFTs are what are used in doing the frequency parsing for codecs. And as you get down at lower bit rates, you start to hear all the coding anomalies. Yeah, some of it's due to the low bit rate, but some of it's due to, stressing the functionality of how an FFT works. But for what we're dealing with here, yes, there's a lot of things we're able to use an FFT for with respect to minimizing or suppressing harmonic distortion, intermod distortion, and things of that nature. So yes, we're, if I may say so modestly, we're kind of proud of being able to accomplish those for signal processing.
Well, that's a good key to cue my next thought, which is talk to us a little bit about the front panel of your latest version, because there's so much that you can see, not just a little tiny display that shows you a couple of bands, but you really can do diagnostic here that you couldn't do before.
Well, Barry, one of the things we've tried to do is to put things together in a manner of speaking of where it would be having a user interface that would kind of sort of replicate the days of when we had boxes in a rack, back in the analog days. That coupled with being able to utilize software to show what the composite spectrum looks like, to show what the left-right audio spectrum looks like, to have the ability to have an oscilloscope, where you can actually look at the waveform, be if it's left, right, I'm speaking for FM now, or the composite signal. These tools are pretty common today in software. And so, no reason why not to provide them, especially given that there's probably a lot of broadcasters where, the days of every radio station being able to have, their own in-house set of test equipment, signal generator, oscilloscope, it was rare that a lot of stations had spectrum analyzers. If we're able to, provide those as tools or part of a toolbox, why not? I think it only, becomes like a value add, if you will.
Absolutely. And if you can, just as an example, see the leases you, without having to drag out all the test gear, you can solve problems almost before they occur.
Right.
There was a discussion that I saw the other day about a station where a particular announcer had complained that she couldn't hear herself at all. And they finally went in and checked, and sure enough, in her headphones, she couldn't hear. And they found out that in the sleeve, there had been a shorting of two wires. And in fact, what she was listening to was the L and the R in series, and they would cancel.
Yep.
So if you have an Elysia pattern, you'll find it right away. But
Yep.
if you have to go hunt and peck, well, there's another story. Frank, let me ask you then, and I'd love to, and I don't want to put you on the spot, but do you think that at some point you could send us Rob to demonstrate some of the things that you can see and do with the product?
Barry, I would say yes. Rob, Rob's a bit more of a quiet guy as compared to me, but I'd be all for having some of our guys, be able to talk with the marketplace, and where your group get to know more of our people, because while I love doing this stuff, and I'm still driven by it, last night I was up putzing around with something at like 11 o'clock at night. I have a way to do development work at home as well as at the office. This is something that will at some point be a baton that I start handing off to others and allow them to carry the legacy forward. And in fairness, they have good ideas and fresh ideas. I've never approached this, whereas it can only be my way. There's certain things that we'll do, and I'll say, okay, guys, technically I know what you're trying to do, but realistically, you really need to do it this way, or give thought to it. But seeing ideas come forward from more of our team has been wonderful, and I've always encouraged it. I'm glad to see it, and the thing that's exciting about it is that for the marketplace, it's an insurance policy, and so far as what's part of Omnia Processing is going to go forward. Whereas, if you look at some of the other organizations, you got to wonder, some of the, as much as I'm still a kid because I still play with trains, the clock on the wall says that, you're 68 years old, and why you can still do it. And I'm glad that I can do it, having younger people with just as much or more passion and ability and drive is I think crucial to the industry and to our organization.
Absolutely. And that was the theme that we were talking about in April at NAB.
Yeah, and Barry, I apologize. This summer I got pulled into too many different directions where I wasn't able to, pull something like that together for today. But if, we can have a rain check, be happy to come back. I'll bring some of the gang and basically introduce them to you guys and then sit back and you guys can spend some time with more of our team.
That would be great. Absolutely great. And we'll arrange for that.
Great.
Does anybody else have a question for Frank? We're coming up on,
And actually, guys, I screwed up because I thought our thing started earlier, and I've got a 3 o'clock that I've got to get to. So I don't have to jump off right now, but if there's questions, I have a few minutes that I can take them.
okay, any questions? Quick. What would you like to know from Frank Foti?
How big is his train layout?
Well, okay, that's a multi-part answer because in HO scale, in my basement, I'm lucky to have a large basement. It's about 20 feet wide by 22 feet in depth. There's no scenery yet. It's the framework's all there. So there's that. In the 8th scale world, I'm a member of I'm a member of a club called the Lakeshore Live Steamers, where we have about 10 acres of land in a county park where, the main line is about a 10-minute ride. And then good friends of mine have a 90-acre blueberry farm in Geneva, Ohio. And the main line there, while it's growing, is about a 30-minute ride. And I think, as a matter of fact, if there's a time that we could do this live, I would say we go out to Geneva, because there we have a wonderful foyer of steam engines. There's a couple of nickel plate Berkshire engines. We have a Union Pacific Challenger, New York Central Hudson, all coal fired. And I'm sure if we do that, we'll have them all out there, and we'll burn coal. And some of you guys will, even if you want, we'll teach you how, and you can pull the throttle a little bit.
We have a lot of folks that are interested in trains. Gordon Carter, whom I'm sure you know,
yeah.
Rich Wood, and people like that. They often put trains up behind them. Brian Urban down there in Texas.
Back in 2018, because so many people would ask me about the steam engine, which is my Boston and Maine Pacific, known as Eastwind. I brought Eastwind and some of the cars out to Vegas, and there's a little 8th scale railroad down near Hoover Dam. And we spent a Sunday afternoon with about 250 customers. And I ran Eastwind for customers. And Joe Cipriani, the voice of ESPN, was behind me. And that was weird. So you hear this mega voice, and my good friend, record producer Gary Katz of Steely Dan fame, was out there, and they all went back to their hotels with some soot and cinders all over them. We could do that.
I remember when you did that, and I really regret that I missed it. I was not able to get there, but
I assure you, one day we'll make the live stream thing happen, and I think it would be fun, even if it's for your group.
Great.
I think it would be a lot of fun.
This may be a last question if somebody else wants to ask a question, but I'll ask this. How did you find Leif?
Leif was when we acquired Linear Acoustic back in 2008. Leif was working with Tim Carroll, and they had been part of something called Octave, and prior to that, Leif had worked at Orban. And Leif went to work at Orban. He came over from Sweden thinking he was gonna, work with Bob. And I guess they had him doing rudimentary user interface stuff. But Leif's passion is processing. So he left and he went and did Octave. And then some people there kind of, let's say, mistreated him, if you will, and he and Tim then went and created Linear Acoustic. So the basis of all the linear acoustic processing was done by Leif, and then he wanted to do something in FM, and at this time we were all working together. I said, Leif, we have the wherewithal, and that's how the Omnia 9 was born.
Oh, really, really great. I was just stunned when I saw it the first time. That was really something.
Smart guy.
Well, everybody, any last words before we let Frank jump off here? Well, Frank,
I hate to do this with with 1 minute left, but we had a presentation from the Super Hi-Fi people a few weeks ago, and you talked about porting your processing to the cloud. Is that where the future is? And as a manufacturer, how do you sell and organize your product to whatever the future of the radio industry is, if it's going to originate out of the cloud and we're no longer buying boxes with very nice interfaces on them, and you're essentially becoming a software company.
Well, Ed, that's a great question, and the way I'll answer it, because my people fought me on this. They wanted everything to go in the cloud, and I told them, I said, you can't put everything in the cloud, because I know there are people out there that they still want a piece of hardware. Granted, the hardware is running software, right? But their comfort is a piece of hardware. So at least we will, meaning our company, we will support the hardware side of life, yet because while the cloud, everyone that's moving, I should say everyone, as the people in the world are migrating towards the cloud, it's still on the front end of the bell curve. If we basically blew off all hardware stuff, I mean, it would, we would feel the effect for a while. So this is going to be, I told our people, it's a gray line we got to walk for a while. And how long that's going to be, I don't know. But I'll tell you this, future Omdia releases, there will be hardware and there will be software. And it'll be that way for a while.
Frank, I can't
Thanks.
thank you enough for your time and enjoyable discussion. And
Again, thank you to you and your entire group for the opportunity to spend time with you guys.
between Zoom and YouTube, we seem to have something on the order of 55 folks here, maybe closer to 60, which is great. And I keep seeing good comments in the comment box. And you tell me what works for you in terms of timing, and let's get your guys and you back here when we can.
Barry, we'll make that happen. And group, I'd love to stay longer, but I'm already seeing messages coming through bugging me for the next thing. So I wish you all the best.
Thanks again, Frank.
You're welcome.
Be well. Well,
I
yes,
could have
Jeff.
I could have listened to his stories about Z100 all afternoon. It's I mean, I remember those days as though they were yesterday.
Where were you working at the time?
At WHTG in Eatontown, New Jersey, and I was also on the road with television repair as well. So in Freehold, living in Jackson and Point Pleasant. So, I mean, all those, I was in a great area actually, because I had both New York and Philly. And, I was actually one of the first 21 listeners that they had. That was the joke around there, that they only had 21 listeners when they first came on the air. But it was it was this after 6 o'clock on August 2nd, 1983. I remember, as I say, I remember it as always yesterday. And
Yep.
yeah.
Well, before we go on, before we lose anybody else because they have to get off, I'm going to ask a question. If there is someone here who is really into history and would like to have something that is really neat, which I picked up from the folks in Cincinnati. One of them is Cincinnati Radio, and this is 1921 to 1941. And then I have one that is Cincinnati Radio, the War Years. I have a version on DVD, and I also have one here on cassette. Hello, cassette. Okay. And I'm not looking for all kinds of cash or anything like that. But if someone would like to pay for shipping and maybe toss in a buck or two more, these are available. I also have Red Barber, story about Red Barber. And if you are a baseball fan and remember the glory days of radio, the Red Barber story is here. So you can contact me privately later or by email or whatever. And I'm happy to pass on this history to folks that are interested in it.
On history, I have hold one up here. It's terrible when this is from the year before I graduated. It's terrible when 73 is now history. And I have this, and I have one from 50 Radio Manual 1959 sitting here on the desk also.
Well, wasn't much, is not a whole lot before 73, but back in the 60s, there was a book that was used in the university to teach broadcasting. And you never forget, that said the turntable is 45, it was 78 or 33. Occasionally 45 might be useful.
Uh-huh.
That was one great line. Another great line was talking about the view meter and talking about how it was necessary to get your levels right and peak around 100. And it said, of course, if your needle goes all the way to the right, that's called bending the needle.
I sent you a link. I used to work at 101 in Houston, and that was really my first exposure to getting processing overdone. The engineer believed in, a nice range of 95 to 99% was his objective. The meter should never move. And he would start with an 8400, then stack other things in series with it. And it changed every day. You came in and it was, he came in at 6, and by 7 o'clock, he had some new configuration on the air.
Oh, yeah. And as Frank said, people, they don't have some fidelity. They really can't tell. I used to have a program director. I've told this story before, that he'd get into his T-Bird and drive around town and call me from, yes, there were telephone boxes in those days.
Yeah.
And he'd keep telling me, turn the bass up, more bass. And every time he would do that, I would turn it down. And he would respond, "Oh, it sounds great. That's wonderful." And finally, after a couple hours of this, and he got what he thought was the best sound, and he asked me what I did. I said, I turned the bass down. And I said, Rich, less is more. And we got on great after that.
Well, he was always changing it. And nobody, he and the PD had a thing going, and he was like, he never asked the PD. He just started doing stuff.
Yep. Oh, I've dealt with PDs that had little greenies in their pocket too. So yeah. Mark, you're down there in South Texas. Anything you have heard in addition to what we've talked about the Houston disaster?
Not really. There are 3 stations on that tower, an AM with a skirt at about 800 feet. That is still off the air at 12:30. They have no backup site for that, but they have 2 FMs, and they're on the air from other facilities around Houston, which is pretty typical. Most, multi-signal groups have cross, backups for each other. So they're not off the air. They're just not on as as a normal thing. I have flown right where that copter had problems at night, and it's just I'm not a pilot, but just as a passenger, it's a bear. I knew right where the tower was. I knew it because I go there all the time, and I couldn't see it at night against the backwash of all the lights from downtown. Even knowing where it was, I couldn't see it. On the other hand, I can't believe the pilot didn't have it marked on her charts, and I just can't believe it. apparently when whatever SBA took over, they figured out the lights were broken, filed a NOTAM immediately, which that should have been a big red flag for anybody flying, you know. So I don't know how that was not taken into account when she was flying. Because there's a video, if you've seen a video on it, there appeared to be no evasive accident. She apparently never saw it, or saw it, you know. At the same time, it impacted her bird. You know, she never saw it early enough to take an evasive, you know, try and swoop away from it. So
I don't know about the 1230 stick, although I do remember that when I visited him in his office there was a transmitter sitting in the stairwell for erection on last ditch, you know, to get a station back on the air, and that was our friend David Stewart, who was the longtime chief at Univision, and he made sure there were auxiliary sites and transmitters for literally everything. So I don't know if that transmitter he put in the hallway is still there or not, but at one time they could have just
of course, I'm sure in this day and age, 1230 is making them a lot less money than everything else. You know, they may just not have enough financial priority to bother with it.
Yeah, could be.
And that site, the area around that site, from the videos I've been watching, has just grown tremendously. One thing you remember about going to that site is down the road there is a commercial coffee grinder facility where they grind coffee beans into Maxwell coffee. The aroma is overpowering when you're at the site if the wind blows the wrong way, and that's still there. So
it's the wrong way to roast beans.
Yeah, and there was also, and there still is, a fire station right at the gate to the property.
Mm-hmm.
One of the Houston fire stations is right there.
It's a little too late. That thing burst into flames almost immediately.
Oh yeah, I mean it's well, I'm sure it had a fuel. You know, it was going to be. They planned on at least an hour flight, so they were full of, and they had just taken off, so they were, you know, full up on the fuel. Thank you. And I don't know. It's pretty sad. I mean, that tower has been there forever. At the end of World War II, some guys that got out of the service decided to get into the radio station business and built that site. And so it's a long time station in Houston history.
Yeah, it's been there at least 50 years from what I've been told.
So yeah, so it used to operate, and I'm trying to think of the guy's name, but I just can't do it. There are several, you know, longtime DJs and stuff that operate out of that site. The studios used to be in a house, which made working on things pretty interesting.
It's a little sad to say that it was hard to see, because with all the current things, whether they be flashing LEDs or infrared or something, we'll never know what happened, but it's just sad to see.
Yeah, well, it's pretty crazy. I don't know, and that, like I say, that site has some history. I don't know if they're going to rebuild it or not. That's you know, or if they can rebuild it, because it's also an EPA Superfund site, because of there's a large number of unknown. Nobody knows the number, but there's a large number of lead acid batteries buried at the site. The former owner allowed that, and so we had to monitor the groundwater with wells and sampling, and the tower base was below grade. It had a sump pump. so you know, so rebuilding at that site is not going to be just an automatic event. And I don't think it would pass any FAA clearance studies, you know, now, because of the proximity to Hobby.
Right. Well, I was thinking that here you have the helicopter into this tower. The balloon went into the KKOB tower. I remember a private pilot flew into the KFI tower back in LA. That had to be almost 20 years ago. And I remember that a plane flew into, and I think that was a military plane flew into the KFBK tower in Sacramento. Now, I know there are others. They don't immediately come to mind.
There was a tower in Dallas at Cedar Hill that was hit by a military plane.
Well,
Also,
the Cedar Hill one was just a real brief story. There are two towers next to each other, and the military pilot, in an unauthorized fashion, decided to put the airplane vertical and fly between the two towers, and he clipped a guy wire in one wing, part of a wing. The engineer at the tower heard the wing crush his van that was outside, came out, looked around, and tried to figure out what the noise was, and his van was about 2 feet shorter than normal. And the airplane made it and made a controlled landing late somewhere nearby.
yeah, well, the airfield is right there beyond the towers. So
it was, and I'm just trying to think of the guy's name, and I cannot. He's a silent key, and I am. But he was telling the story on the radio for quite a few days after that his van got crushed by the military.
What happened?
So in the end, they had to take that. It was a 1,000-foot, 1,100-foot candelabra. I think they had to take it down to either 800 or 600 feet and then build it back up again.
Yeah, it twisted twisted everything.
Yeah, the story that I had heard is that the site actually had a someone was at the site when it happened, and the engineer who was on site called back to the studio and said, hey, I think an airplane just hit the tower. And the engineer at the studio looked at the off-air monitor and said, what have you been drinking? I can clearly see it. And he says, well, I don't know, but the FM stations won't stay on the air. And there's a guy in a parachute coming down, or airplane parts coming down in the yard, because what they basically did was tear off part of the candelabra, the tower structure. Somebody even said, if he was in a vertical climb trying to stay away from the tower, he would have been fine until he got to the top where the candelabra was.
Yeah, well, it was probably 10, 12 years ago here in Corpus, maybe even longer, 15. A foggy night, many people reported hearing a strange sounding helicopter, and it was a training flight going from one place to another, and they heard what sounded like the helicopter having mechanical distress, and it was a minesweeper, so it was a big heavy copter, and it clipped the top of KEDT's tower, which was built in 1946. The tower never came down. It survived. The helicopter did not. And one of the 6 crew members survived the forced land, survived the copter falling out of the air. And it took about 6 years to get the military to rebuild their tower because it put a twist in it when it hit. And I just knew the engineer at that time. And one of the first questions was, well, the tower lights had to be out. We couldn't see your tower. And I remember a key piece of evidence was a piece of dot matrix fanfold paper that showed like 3 minutes before the impact, the tower lights were functional. And he just logged all that stuff to a physical piece of paper, and that pretty well just closed that argument. And so KEDT has a relatively new tower. It's just sad that something built in the 40s finally met its demise.
There's a similar story near Albany, Georgia, actually in Doe Run, Georgia, about 20 years ago. There's a military Chinook on a training mission, clipped guy wire on one of the 1,002. There's 2, they were so close, the guy wires interweaved. It clipped one of the guy wires, lost the helicopter. It was an Army Reserve chopper, but it didn't topple the tower. This is Channel 8 and Channel 30, which are now both Raycom or whoever owns that now on a candelabra. But so they wanted to bring the tilted tower down So they dynamited the guy wires, hoping that it would allow the other one to stay, but it didn't. It turned into a weed whacker and took both towers down. So that's not unusual. These, particularly these choppers out there intertwining with stuff like that. That, by the way, both those stations at the time were owned by Gray Communications.
I think I was not in the area. Matter of fact, I'm not sure if I was born, but a long time ago, the Channel 7 tower, which was ABC in Washington, was hit. And I don't know if it managed to be repaired or a new tower was put in the same place, but it's on the campus of American University and has no television anymore, but has a big combined FM antenna that was just replaced in the last couple of years. But that tower had suffered a unexpected attack from an aircraft. Ed worked for a station that had the same thing happen to it on its first day with a new, what would become a very successful format.
Oh, that was the WCBS AM tower that got hit in 1967 on the inaugural day of broadcasting the all news format. The twin engine Beach Bonanza took out the tower, hit it on a very foggy day, and there went the tower.
Yeah, the first day of WCBS All News was actually mostly heard on WCBS FM because they moved the programming over there, I guess, in a big hurry.
So is that tower out on Long Island? I understood that that and another AM were on the same tower.
Oh,
Or
WNBC was diplexed into the same tower, and the tower was on a little island just off the Bronx there in an area they call City Island. So it's up in the Long Island Sound, just a little east of the Bronx there. But WNBC and WCBS were diplexed into that tower.
So they were both off the air.
Yep.
is that the case yet today? Did they reconstruct it on the same place? It must have been a beautiful AM ground plane.
Yeah, when people don't steal the copper, but yeah, they rebuilt a new tower on the same concrete pier that the original tower was on. NBC put up the temporary tower in Long Island City, and WCBS put up the temporary 200-foot tower just a little west of where the main tower was, and then years later changed it to a 300-foot tower, and I think that's the configuration that remains today is the main tower and 300-foot AUX.
Isn't that where the former WNBC and CBS are, and ABC is a different place now?
Well, ABC has been in Lodi for New Jersey, as long as I can remember, but you go way back in history, WCBS was on its own island called Columbia Island, further out in Long Island Sound, and WNBC, even though it was a 50 kilowatt clear channel, had built a 2-tower array in Sands Point on Long Island, up near where the Merchant Marine Academy is. And then around 1960, I guess, they got together and decided to build this combined facility on High Island.
Yeah, and it actually had, I mean, I think the original tower, I don't think they restored it that way, was actually sectionalized. So they had hoped to be able to tune it for 66 and 88.
It was, but
never really worked properly.
Never really worked out because they pretty early on they actually strapped out the sectionalizing, so it looked like a 5/8 wave to WCBS on 880, and it looked like a half wave to WNBC on 660. My favorite piece of material from the file cabinet had one might remember Augie Prestholt, also in broadcasting heaven these days, is a memo from him. They were originally proposing, when they built the thing, to use one of the guy wires as an aux. They didn't actually have an aux tower when they originally built it. And he said, well, the chances of ever using it are really slim. But if we have to, we can use one of the guy wires as an aux. Of course, when the tower came down, there went that idea. I reminded him of it when I saw him at an NAB years and years ago. And he said, I thought we burned that memo. And I go, oh, no, I'm keeping it.
No, I was hoping, actually, with all the audio processing people that were here, I was hoping to try and confirm something. The story that I've been told for a long time is in early Optimod days, and I can't find anybody that can confirm or deny it. But the company that I work for had one of the first 50 or 100 Optimod 8000s because the station owner knew Eric Small, maybe, or I can't remember, somebody at the company. And it was in a very small market compared to where all the other 8000s were going. And if anybody has ever worked on one of those, you know that inside there is a piece of potted circuitry. And that was like where the secrets were in the 8000.
Most of them in that time did that. CRL was the same
Yeah.
way.
Well, the story that I got was that up to that time, the big successful audio chain was Audimax Volumax, built by CBS Laboratories. And Optimod was certain that CBS would get one of the first Optimods and take it apart to, find out what they could do with their successful Audimax Volumax. And so the story that I was told is that if you take one of the first about 100 Optimod 8000s apart and X-ray that potted circuit, there was a lead shield inside the potting that would, when you develop the film, you would get a CBS eyeball on the film. And I never found anybody who could confirm or deny that they did that. But they knew CBS was going to want to know what was inside that can, so they fixed it so they couldn't find out, and also did a little gotcha with the image.
When I put the University of Missouri station on, NPR affiliate in 1973, it had an Audimax, a Volumax, and a composite Mosley STL with the SCG 3T stereo generator all at the studio. It was one of the first in the country to do that.
Yeah, that was the stereo generator with the big yellow and green stereo mono button, I think. Was that a Mosley?
That might have been the older SCG 9. This was the new 3T, which was the anodized panel. We had a bunch of SCA subcarriers there, one for everything. I had a question on this stick that came down in Houston for the group. There was an AM on there. Okay, here's a 1,000-foot tower, 12:30 AM. How, and all these FMs on it. How was that fed?
I don't have a lot of details on the antenna, but there's a skirt-fed antenna with the top of it was about 650 to 700.
Unipole.
An elevated skirt antenna.
Okay.
There's, I don't know I don't know the story of how they got that approved, and all I can remember when I worked there is it was very stable. We never screwed with it. The readings were very non-changing.
Well, they were not uncommon. I mean, they weren't common, but
the only
you usually have to do that if you sited at a place where there was no base insulator.
Yeah, the only other story about that did affect the tuning of that antenna, the AM antenna, was sometimes the guy wires had eggs in them, big ceramic, eggs up near the top of the tower. And once while I was there, the tower guy had to put on a little, I call it a trolley, but attached himself to the guy wire, slid down and cleaned up all those insulators. So he had to ride down, clean, go all the way to the ground, and then climb up and do it again. Cleaning, because about every 2 years you had to clean the insulators of the industrial grime because that would start affecting the AM
I've
performance.
been around short rounded towers that were shunt fed. There's a magic point to do that.
Yeah.
Quite as efficient as a series fed. This
Well,
sounds like some concoction in between.
I was only involved with that for about a year before we bought it and then sold it. So I didn't have that much involvement with the whole thing.
Well, I have an AM story I was just exposed to, Barry. I did some traveling, and my first stop, I went to a church conference at Unity Village, Missouri, which is right next to Lee's Summit. It's been there for almost 100 years. And back in the teens, they had an AM radio station, I came to find out. They put it up on top of the old 7th Street location. And it was 500 and then changed to 1,000, and they hopped frequencies. This was in the late 20s. Apparently they made quite a bit of money off it. It was a religious organization. But the story that I dug out of the archives, the archivist there was kind of up on it, and was that there were so many AM radio stations in that period of time hopscotching around the dial trying to get more listeners. And some would even be on the same frequencies, and as this was the case between Kansas and Missouri. And when the commission started to come into focus in the late 20s, I guess they became an entity in 1934, they basically looked at all the radio stations that were doing this and said, there's too many of you. And the story was there were too many in the state of Missouri, which kind of blows my mind. Again, these were just kilowatt. And they were told to shut down. I'd never heard that story, but that's apparently that's not too unusual. Did anybody run into that part of pre-FCC? Or is that a magic story?
I do know there were share time operations that had, when they couldn't give everybody their own frequency, they'd say, okay, you get it for this many hours and you get it for that many hours. And there's a famous one in Dallas that there were 2 frequencies and 2 owners, and they switched regularly because one had a much better signal than the other one. No, they were co-located.
That was WBAP and WFAA. WFAA was on 570 at 5 kilowatts, and BAP was on 820 at 50 kilowatts. And the transmitter site that all ended when they were building out or expanding DFW Airport, and the transmitter site was in the way of the runway expansion. So at that point, they built separate facilities. But yes, every 6 hours, they would ring the cowbell and they would switch frequencies. True story.
Well, that's done with low power TV allotments. I know there's an operator here on the West Coast that has several of them, including Channel 14 on Sutro. And the 3 of them all qualified, so they got together and they divided up the hours of the day. So that that's something that's done, I guess, even with the new stuff. But this was back in the 20s, and there was nobody. It's like a highway with no traffic signals, I guess. And they were duking it out. And the picture of the transmitter, and I couldn't recognize it. It was a whole rack for the 500 watt, if you can imagine.
Well, some places built their own. I had the remains of a I think it was a 1230 in Indiana that I think they had bought a this was an FM in the 40 megahertz days probably or something, and they had bought a very low powered transmitter, and the engineers at the station built the high powered amplifier. And so it had no manufacturer. It was just how it was done.
Yeah, I remember there at Rolla, there was a AM/FM KTTR, and the chief engineer there came out of World War II, and He went to school at the university and so forth, and the transmitter was called the Mitchum because his name was Martin Mitchum, and he built it. He built some. He had some Gates parts in it, but that was rather infamous. That's how he got it on there, and that was only kilowatt day 259 on 1490. He went on to become my boss. He hired me to build 100 kilowatt FM there.
But I guess the other thing that I saw in an old newspaper article, I think it was, there were agreements or understandings, or I don't know what they were, but in the earliest days of AM commercial broadcasting, there were certain cities that had a silent night, and all the stations in the city would go off the air for one night a week so that you could listen DX to other stations out of town. I don't know how many cities did it or how long it was done, because you can't imagine that kind of cooperation lasting far into the era where there were, like once network radio came, I'm sure you could not possibly do that. But it was like, well, we'll all go off on Tuesday night and people can listen to the stations out of town.
Just the suggestion of that would probably lead to some type of episodes.
But I don't know, there was, at the beginning it was like, well, nobody's ever going to make any money off of this anyway, so they were experimental science projects, and it took a long time for somebody to make money off of them.
When I was in high school, there was, speaking about not making money, AM stations apparently had a first crack at getting an FM. And there was a kilowatt daytime Omni shunt fed, or at least it was shunt fed when I got there, KSTL 690. I think it's a religious station now, but they got 100 kilowatt FM assignment in St. Louis, which, by the way, is still there and doing gangbusters, as you might expect. But they tried to keep that thing going for a while, and a guy out of the San Diego area, Dick Friedman, I think was his name, he went around the country and bought these things up, probably just to take the debt load off their hands. And it was 100 kilowatt FM on that tower, which is right across from the arch next to the Peabody Coal sign in East St. Louis, all fed by phone lines. And so he changed the call letters to what was under construction at the riverfront at the time, KRCH, KARCH 98.1. How's that for a frequency with 100 kilowatts in that market? And so he traded out everything and came to, I imagine, made a ton of money by the time he turned that around. And I got a $1 an hour job there with my third phone, talking to some of my CB friends. But there's a case where they just couldn't afford this FM. Of course, that was 67 I started there, so it wasn't exactly widespread listenership.
Yeah, well, somebody told me that in particular in St. Louis, and I'm sure it was the case in a lot of markets, up until the mid 60s, and for some of them even later, you could buy a full power FM station in one of these markets basically for the price of the equipment, because the people who owned them, they weren't very efficient. And so you had a big electric bill and no one was listening. So eventually, you could convince somebody to sell it to you, but you had to be prepared to, keep the overhead, because nobody had figured out how to make money with it.
Well, this was a 10 kilowatt Western Electric transmitter with a 10-bay horizontal only antenna. And it was monaural, and they tried a couple times to put a Wilkinson exciter in there to go stereo. And the college student chief, who became a friend of mine, because I was still in high school, they couldn't quite make that work. So I don't know what the interface would be off a Western Electric exciter.
Well, if we go back into history on why these FMs weren't making any money, it's because a lot of people felt that they got screwed when they moved the frequency from the 45 up to the 88 to 108, and rendered all those radios that people were buying. And at that time, I mean, we were the FM radio receiver itself was expensive. Only to have it, the FCC tell you it's no good anymore. Now you have to buy another one. That was a major screw up, really, with the FCC, really, when you think.
Oh no, that was a very smart business move by a company. That band was moved because RCA and David Sarnoff were terrified of FM radio because it worked better than AM radio. So let's make sure all those radios become obsolete.
Well, didn't World War II happen in between that switch? They shut it down at 6 meters and came back after World War II at 2 meters, huh?
Yeah, I'm not sure of all the timing, but I do know that the stations that were there were not it was not some idea at the FCC to say let's move these. It turned out to probably be a good thing because the television people discovered that 40 megahertz was not, I mean, even channel 2 is what, at 54, and the frequencies that were lower than that just didn't, the atmospheric behavior and everything else, that was not a good place for a broadcast medium, but it did sort of work. And then they wound up getting pushed to that practically to the aircraft band, but it was mostly, I think, a scheme of RCA as they were trying to make sure that when they were having their fight with Armstrong over FM, it was the way to put them under. It was obsolete every single radio
to the point where Armstrong jumped out a window.
Yep.
Sounds like something Sarnoff would do.
Yeah, Sarnoff had quite the reputation there in his Princeton labs. There's still a little museum there and a ham club there. I think it's called SEI or now something, research.
Sarnoff Research or Stanford Research Inc. Been that way for.
Yeah, they're into more than electronics, big pharmaceutical stuff there. And it's right across Highway 1 from the university. Almost right across, maybe a mile away.
Yeah, and Johnson & Johnson's up there and a few other pharmies.
Yeah, it's quite a corridor.
Don't get stuck in rush time. Or slow time, as the case may be.
Yeah, my daughter did her thesis there at Princeton about US-1, going back to British times. And that was originally a wood-planked toll road. And they put a big cloverleaf turnaround jug handle in front of Sarnoff Labs. That's where she met the fine folks from Parsons Brinkerhoff, where she went to work for years.
Are you talking about in Connecticut or New Jersey now?
You know where the Princeton University is? You ever been there?
Yeah. It's
It's not in Connecticut. It's in Princeton, New Jersey.
Yeah,
right across US-1 from Sarnoff Lab site, right? And
right.
Princeton Junction train station.
Yeah, I've been there. As far as that goes. In fact, there was a Sarnoff museum right there in the RCA building too. But no, as somebody mentioned Connecticut, and that's what had me.
No.
Yeah.
Not me.
Okay. Yeah, that's what had me confused. Yeah, no, and the thing is, that's why there were a lot of Princeton graduates working for a lot of these companies. It's because of the proximity.
Mm.
Yeah, great. Great. Hey, yeah, low fruit, man.
Spent a fair amount of time up there back in the
Yeah.
85 for the 6 months I worked for RCA.
I guess a lot of television itself, color, both analog and digital television, all came out of that lab back when it was still RCA. I guess when GE bought RCA, I think they sold that lab off.
I felt,
Eventually.
yeah, one of the things that I noticed when I did visit, I thought that there was that when they were developing television, there were several different teams that were doing it, and one of the things that I thought that they had going for them was the channel 2, channel 3. I'm sorry, channel 3, channel 4, rather, at that time. Whereas they wanted channel 3 and channel 4 because of the fact that they were right next to each other. And so as far as being able to pick up one without the the disturbance of the other, with this in that 6 megahertz bandwidth.
Well, all the VHF channels, low and high band, are contiguous with each other except for the break between 6 and 7.
And 4 and 5.
Right. And I heard the reason for that was the FCC, as they made allotments to cities. You were told which you'd be on. And in order to free that up a bit, so you never had a 3 and 4 in the same city because of that. And that was about 76 megahertz. I hear there was some radio telephony and model airplanes there too, garage doors.
Between 4 and 5.
Yeah.
Yep.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
No. I think it's between 3 and 4. Because there's in St. Louis, there was a 4 and a 5.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, New York is 4 and 5 also.
Right. I mean, the tightest pack you could get was 2, 4, 5,
Okay.
7, 9, 11, 13.
Well, the break
St. Louis
was
has
behind-
all of those except 13.
Yeah, that was the New York 7, as I called them. Mm-hmm. The New York 7. Anybody, any other channel other than 2, 4, 5, 7, 9, 11, and 13, nobody watched. You could have UHF, but when you looked at the amount of people that were watching those 7, none of the UHFs ever came close.
Of course, also it was highly preferable to be low band V in the real early days, and people didn't want to be on the high band Vs for exactly the same reason. And that's part of the reason why there's a different ERP. At low band V, this is analog now, 100 kilowatt, and then high band V was 316 kilowatt. It was because of propagation, and it was very desirable to be on low band V. Thus, you had CBS and NBC mainly on channels 2, 4, and 5 throughout the country. And then along come the late guy, ABC, and they were put on 7. So they had trouble trying to break in, as the UHFs did way later on. But then, of course, the FCC mandated UHF tuners. Like you can see my TV set on your screen, that has a UHF tuner. That's a mandate.
Well, and then they also, years after that, the UHF tuners were just, basically a continuous dial.
Right.
So tuning them was harder. So then they had the next thing they had was that it had to be a click stop tuner so that they were the same as the Vs. And when the TV manufacturers came up with essentially electronic tuners with a Vericap in them, that was when the UHFs had some hope, because all of the tuner circuits had to be rebuilt to comply. I mean, it didn't make the propagation any better, but it was pretty easy to miss channel 34 or whatever it was if it was a slider. So they changed that.
I remember growing up in St. Louis when the first UHF came. That was 30. There's several there now, of course.
Well, that was actually the second round of UHF in St. Louis. But yeah, I remember watching Mr. Patches on Channel 30.
Yeah, there was some 1 kilowatters, KWK and stuff way back when, understood, but
Well, KWK started out with, it was owned by the
double.
one of the papers,
Yeah.
and it was on 4. And CBS got the license for 11 and called the newspaper and said, we would like to buy your license for Channel 4, or in 90 days, you can face the prospect of being an independent. And they did not want to do that. So CBS bought Channel 4, built Channel 11, and sold it to Ted Koppler. And there was a WTVI in St. Louis that was part of the first UHF round, which I think was on 14. And 2 was in Springfield, Illinois. And that the commission also had this idea that they would create VHF markets and UHF markets and try to not have them mixed because the UHFs couldn't compete. And so 2 was moved to St. Louis, and St. Louis became an all VHF market, and Springfield, Illinois got, I guess it was 14, and it became an all UHF market.
Yeah, there was if you remember the old rules of the 7, 7, and 7.
The ownership rules, yeah.
Yeah, 7 FM, 7 AM, 7 FM, and 7 TV stations, as long as 2 of them were UHF.
Right, you could only have 5 Vs.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. Yeah.
You aware of that UHF handicap, I think they call it? It's still in existence now for viewership and ownership, that if you operate a UHF station, I think it's back to the old assignments because everybody's hopscotching, of course, here at DTV, but that only counted for half of the viewership as far as number of subscribers in a particular area, and that feeds directly into the ownership cap. I think it's called a handicap. They may have another word for that.
Yeah, I remember
It's
that.
been fought out in Congress for quite a while, and that allows people like Sinclair and Nexstar to own more than they really should, because those old circles don't mean anything anymore. But just like the must-carry rule, still on the books.
Yeah, I think there was also a rule. I'm getting 2 rules confused, but maybe somebody here will remember or correct me. But when RKO had their licenses revoked, the way that I remember what the rule was. There were no VHF television stations in the state of New Jersey.
Commercial VHF is
Right,
how it actually worked. Yeah.
And the way that somebody saved Channel 9 was they moved it to Secaucus because there was something written in the rules that if you placed a commercial VHF station in New York or in New Jersey, that license would be granted without any, competitive licensing or anything. So Channel 9 was originally licensed to New York City. It was moved to Secaucus to preserve the license, which didn't really change anything. And apparently there was also, that rule remained in effect. And somebody built Channel 6 in New Jersey so that the sound carrier that was right at the bottom of the FM dial could be used as a radio station in New York, and it's still there. And the commission did not want to license it, and they said, this law is still in place that VHF station built in New Jersey, the license will be granted. And so, to the best of my knowledge, it still exists, and it's still a
I
radio
heard a
station.
different version of that, and it had to do with Channel 3, which is up on the new Freedom Tower with a Jampro antenna, by the way. Bob McCune out of New Jersey put that in, and they saw that loophole and wanted to force a VHF commercial into New Jersey. And by the way, it doesn't matter where the transmitter is, because even the old KHJ was still on World Trade. And the commission really fought it. But he went ahead and did it and made a ton of money on it. And I think there's a 6 in serving New Jersey also, but it's operated out of Philadelphia, and that's been the
Well, there's
So,
always been a 6, well, I say always, but
they actually
a 6
moved
in
those.
Philadelphia, but the transmitter originally was over in Jersey at one
Yeah, I
time.
think 6 is a commercial, isn't that CBS? Oh no, that's
No,
3.
it's-
Who's 6?
it's ABC.
KBVI, is that
ABC.
ABC 6 in Philly? Yeah,
Yeah, it's a Disney, and we have a 3 here in Philly too.
yeah, which is CBS, right? KYW.
Now, yeah.
Well, actually, that's not always true now. The 2 and the 3 are actually swapped now. 2 is licensed. What happened was Press Broadcasting went back when we went digital and went into that RKO into that RKO deal. And so they bought 2 radio stations, one in Ely, Nevada, and another one I can't remember where it was. They were Channel 2 and Channel 3. They moved the Channel 3 to New York and the Channel 2 to the Philly market. And that's the one. It's not on Freedom Tower. It's actually on 4 World Trade is where that Channel 3 is.
I think they've moved
in
it.
Philly.
I think they've moved it
Since when? Oh, when did they move it?
a couple years ago because of the shadowing around 4 Times Square.
No, they could have. Remember that's where it was built anyway.
Right.
Yeah, and that yeah. Who would have figured that you buy a station in Ely, Nevada, and move it to New York City?
Well, it's part of this old, if you don't have a VHF commercial station in the state of New Jersey, you can do it.
Yeah, it's licensed actually to Middletown as what it is, WJLP.
Yeah.
And if the first part of that call letter sounds familiar, the station that they did own at one point was WJLK in Asbury Park. And they ended up selling that, buying Kicks in Trenton, but and then going with the TV stations. So, but Bob McGowan, yeah.
Yeah, I met him. I met him at the Jampro booth several years ago at NAB. Nice guy and so forth. I said, didn't you own that? They called it News Jersey 101. It was from the tower there at Quaker Bridge Mall, not far from the Sarnoff. He said, yeah, well, he sold that off.
Yeah.
I guess the man is quite wealthy. But that was fun station to listen to because they focused on New Jersey news and it was oldies on the weekend and stuff. And when I was up there visiting.
The slogan was not New York, not Philadelphia, New Jersey 101.5.
Yeah, News Jersey.
Yes, actually. Yeah. You had and you're right. That they used the News Jersey at the top of the hour when they would go to Newark, when they would go to news. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that was the New Jersey Public Television Tower there. They were on top of that with their
Channel 52. Yeah, was there. Yeah, that New Jersey broadcast, New Jersey Network, NJN. It's now pretty much defunct, but they had 4 channels. One was the Channel 52 in licensed to Trenton. There was a Channel 50, which was WNJM originally, and that was Channel 50 in licensed from Montclair. Channel 23 was I'm thinking was there was actually 4 of them. Channel 23 was licensed for Camden. I think they were, and there was WNJB out of New Brunswick. And
Larry Will, he's still kicking. He was the director of engineering there at New Jersey. And John Wilner before him.
Yeah.
So I got to sell equipment to both those guys. They put a Mosley remote control on their PBS downlink because it had to be remote, or as they called it, non-co-located. It was a 10-meter Andrew, those receive dishes for PBS in the 70s. And that was all in the 70s when I lived and worked for for Mosley in Santa Barbara. So I got to meet those two guys.
Hmm.
And John, I've been going to the FCCE get-togethers and stuff. I guess Larry Wills isn't getting around much like he used to before, but he was a lot of fun to work with.
I think it was Chris Christie, the governor of New Jersey at the time. I think he's the one who somewhat gutted New Jersey Network.
Yeah, I heard all kinds of stories like that. And I think there was some UHF, VHF swaps with commercial stations and stuff they took advantage of. It was kind of hard. And, one of their transmitters, I believe, was on World Trade, even though it was licensed in New Jersey. And there was some intrigue there on swapping that off and shutting it down. They didn't need all 4 stations, like Georgia doesn't need all 9 stations. Those are the old days. But doesn't surprise me because they ran a news operation there that the governor would often disagree with, particularly when it was a Republican governor.
No, the TVs are mostly run by New York now.
Yeah, didn't
The radios are run by HYY.
yeah, I heard that they kind of doled that out.
Yeah.
I was director of engineering for Pennsylvania Public Television for a while there as they shut it down. That's so I got to know the governor's name there that shut it down. I'll think of it in a minute. Rem, something with an R. Anyway, and we had
Rendell.
Yeah, Rendell. They totally shut it down. I was there a little over a year. I actually commuted up to Hershey where they were. But they had 2 stations in Philly, HYY, and there was another UHF that was just
Well, there was 35, but that was not really, that was kind of a weird station from the beginning.
Yeah, well, apparently they, when they came time to doling the money out to the public stations, they made the list, although nobody wanted them there. And there was always some palace intrigue as to how they were funded and who was running it and stuff. And it was a secondary PBS for that.
Yeah, well, the guy that started it up made a bundle.
Yeah, that's what I came to find out. Of course, with the
Yeah.
local there in Harrisburg, WITF, and
Yeah,
I think there
30,
was
35 or 39 took over a lot of that program, and 35 had, but 39 also dumped their transmitter. So they made a small bundle.
And of course, they had Pittsburgh and State College. There was a big, I think it was a Channel 3 analog up in State College. They did an SFN up there as they changed channels. That was kind of fun to be associated with. And then, of course, up in Erie, that was quite a collection of stations. So they looked at me and said, well, you don't have any kids and you're living in an apartment and right next to the governor's mansion downtown Harrisburg. So they gave me some money and said, why don't you head back south? So I gladly took it. But they were trying to keep that alive as a secondary to the state emergency alert system. All the states, including Georgia, went through that, and they're still doing it with ATSC-3. That's a big reason to keep ATSC-3 alive is emergency alerting. And of course, that's a fracas to get involved in. And the guy that just retired from North Carolina, I'll think of his name here. Maybe you guys do. I think he gave a presentation here, Barry, not long ago. A well-storied chief engineer amongst PBS that just retired from North Carolina. And the whole thing at North Carolina is the same emergency alerting on ATSC-3, and there's quite some technical tricks that allows. But if you want to put that on the backbone of a TV station, I don't know. Of course, that's once again the story of ATSC-3.
Barry, your Zoom, I'm looking at Mark up on that YouTube, and that's I'll tell you that he's got that box is right in there perfectly. That TV. However, however your adjustments are, it's perfect.
Well, that's coming right out of the Zoom background
Mhm.
utility.
Well,
It said pick one, and I picked that one because mostly Barry doesn't like it.
did I open up a can of worms here?
No, I like it. I use it all the time because I don't have a powerful enough computer to do uh, the Keller key. But if you look in setup, that's one of the things you can select. So there it is.
Mm.
And that's coming from Zoom itself, so that's not me.
Well, I'll give you an animated one, and then I'm probably going to go. I just got a note that there's something waiting for me down in the lobby. But
Oh,
since we're,
yes.
since we're all old enough, people will remember these.
The thing is, there's other peacocks like that. There's the original peacocks, and then of course there was the one that they finally did settle on, that they used until 1974.
Right. Well, these three were all the same announcement. They were run in the 60s and early 70s, and the voiceover was, "The following program is brought to you in color."
Mhm.
Or living color.
If it was
On
NBC, it
NBC.
was Living Color. If it was CBS, it was "The following program is brought to you in color." And I think ABC's was "This is an ABC color presentation."
Yes.
And
Yeah.
CBS was someday we'll get around to color. But since the color wheel is not chosen, it'll be a while. Hey, when I joined Scientific Atlanta in '88, we were still rotating out audio cards on the analog satellite, the 6.2 and 6.8 subcarriers, because they were built, but they were never phase aligned. So you'd have L plus R problems. So we were sending out maybe a dozen a week or something when I got there. So I was sitting down in actually Bob Seidel's office in New York and going over things. And I said, "Hey, I hear you guys are just going stereo." And I said, "Well, it didn't really surprise me because are you color yet?" So sore subject there. Now you can see why I don't have my video on because I'm not dressed. It was hardly noon out here.
All right, fellas, I got to go downstairs and get the packet of SBE exams that's at my front desk.
Well, very
Thanks for
good.
showing those.
I'm the certification chairman here at Chapter 40. I got a guy coming up for a CBRE soon.
I've got two coming up, and it turns out that one of the weekends where we would do it, I'm going to be in Las Vegas seeing the Eagles at the Sphere, so I cannot proctor that time. And I talked to Megan at SBE, and it's like, just get it in whenever you can. Because the other thing is, one of the people is disabled and needs more time to take the exam. And so between trying to find a big enough window and everything, it's like, just slot it in where you can do it. It's like, no problem. So once I have these exams in hand that are downstairs, I'm going to actually run them over to our chapter chair is over at WETA. And I'm going to say, here, we always do the exams at his transmitter site because we've been doing that since the pandemic. And I'm just going to say, put these in your drawer. That way, if it turns out that we have to give the exams during the weekend that I'm in Vegas, you'll have them because they won't do any good sitting on the counter in my kitchen.
The big, I was CERT chairman in Atlanta for a long time, but I left there 8 years ago now. But the biggest test being taken was a CBNE. Actually, I gave it to Chris Crump. You know, Chris? That was the hottest thing going, and rightfully so.
Yeah, I think I'm trying to remember. I have I think our chapter chair, I think, is getting ready to take the networking exam, the new one. And the other one is a 3-hour exam, and I can't remember which one, but he has the opportunity to take 6 hours because of the disability that he worked out with Megan. It's like, well, I'm sure we can work it out. And I haven't asked her yet because I'm hoping to get it all done in one sitting. But if 6 hours is too long for anybody to sit for one, you know, you could always give them half the questions and then come back another day and give them the other half, or give them all of them and just say, all right, we're gonna pick up the exam at 3 hours and then find another empty window and you pick up where you were. But I also have I have a suspicion. I think the exam he's taking, you know, disability or no disability, I don't remember anybody who has ever needed more than an hour and a half on that particular exam. So I'd be stunned if he's not done by 3 hours in, but he has the
You
option
given
for
any,
more.
you given any ATSC3 tests? I never gave one.
I think I've had a couple.
So
Because
I did the beta test with SBE and I don't know if I passed it, but I said, does this entitle me to it? And Megan said, sure, it's yours.
I think Fred Willard has taken one. He's with Univision in town. And I want to say, I think some of the people at the Sinclair / Albritton / Sinclair station have taken it. And then you know, Washington, the donor station for ATSC3 in Washington is the secondary PBS station at Howard University. I'm almost certain no one from there has taken it. So I probably should just call somebody over there and say, you know, you're already doing this stuff. And I got to figure that, you
Yeah,
know,
give 'em credit.
somebody has talked to you about it. You guys ought to just, you know, take the exam.
What I ended up doing, I'm also a ham radio VE with the local ham clubs, and I ended up we did that once a month in Gwinnett County. And when I had an SBE guy, I told him just to come to that and I'd proctor everything at the same time. Of course, there were 3 of us on the ham side, and that worked out pretty good, except they were over there with a bunch of books taking longer time. And I also suggested that don't waste your time taking the CBT, get your amateur extra, and then the CBT's a gimme, and you get both. And, you know,
Yeah.
without any Morse code, it's a slam dunk. And a
Yeah, I
couple
need to
people
sit
did
for that one, actually. I kept saying I was going to, and then I haven't. But
What,
I've
the
got some folks.
CBT?
No, the extra.
Yeah.
But I'm sure there's a
Oh.
group over in. I don't know if there's anybody in DC that's a VE, but I know there's several in Maryland that
Well, you have to
schedule
be
them
in center.
regularly.
You got to have 3 hams together to do that.
Yeah, and there's a
It's multiple choice. It's pretty simple. Even
you know, there's a ham fest in twice a year in Maryland that I always get the notices for, and they always are giving exams. I'm sure the same thing happens in Virginia.
well, bear in mind the typical exam taker, even for extra, is a middle schooler. So don't get spooked. If you can't walk in that test blindfolded and pass it as a broadcast professional, you're not doing your job.
Well, the biggest challenge is that for 23 years, my broadcast professional stuff was Sirius XM, which involved no RF at all.
Well, sure it is. There's the
And,
transmitters. You're uplinking. Isn't there one up at Vernon Valley?
Well,
Another one downtown DC?
there was one there, and there's one in DC, but
Yeah.
it was a different bunch of people that took care of the uplinks. But the other, of course, I had to do all the downlink, and there was actually worse RF
Yeah.
filtering that we had to do to downlink everything.
You know, there's
all the
probably more
C-band stuff.
satellite. There's more satellite theory on the ham test than there is on any of the
broadcast ones.
broadcast stuff, particularly Sirius XM, because all the broadcasters are just mainly geostationary or SNG trucks.
Yeah, and
Which is
the
stationary. Yeah.
you know, the other Sirius XM thing was we had a guy. When I started there, it was a very small group of people. I know we were less than 100 people, and I think I was employee number 80 or something. And there was a guy who was responsible for getting the studio and uplink facility for XM built in the building that they purchased across from FedEx in Washington. And the guy who was responsible for getting it, the physical beating all the contractors into submission to get it built on schedule was a guy named Jack Wormington, who had been a 5-star general and built the launch pads in Cape Canaveral. And I remember sitting at lunch with him one time and saying, Jack, I gotta love you, because for the first time ever, somebody has finally moved the transmitter far enough away that I don't have to go there, because you put it in outer space.
There you go. Well, except for the uplink transmitter.
Right.
Right.
And then we actually built a backup at a facility in Georgia that kind of got a side job that spiraled out of hand.
Now, part of Sirius XM is geostationary, and the other is geosync.
They're all synchronous now.
Well, they're okay. I didn't know that.
Yeah, the first round.
One was one way and one was the other, but they're all synchronous now.
Right. Yeah. Sirius actually had an uplink in like Ecuador, and they had the Molnoya orbits, but the first set of replacement satellites were a pair of stationaries, and of course XM was always a pair of stationaries, and they, over time, as leases expired, they combined the repeater networks so that complicated orbit system was just not needed anymore, because both bands, which still operate as separate bands,
is that still because of Canada?
No, the biggest reason is that there's a law that, unless it has changed since I left. I mean, I left in 23, but the Sirius radios could not pick up the XM broadcasts, and the XM radios could not pick up the Sirius broadcasts.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a law that you could not obsolete all those car radios for like 10 years or 20 years, whatever it was.
Well,
So
there was a law too when they were licensed that they'd never merge.
Oh, I'm aware of that. Actually, the merger of those two companies, because I was very intimate with that, is the longest potential merger in the United States. It took however many years that it took, because it was viciously opposed by the NAB, all the way down to having the side of their building draped with FCC don't allow this. But of course, the US government approved the joining of Exxon and Mobil in like less than a year. And
well,
that thing went on forever.
DirecTV and Dish was another long drawn out that I guess is actually coming to an end here.
Yeah, well, they're purchasing each other. So, I don't know whose money is buying what, but but basically when we were going to the third satellite, or when we were launching the new satellites on XM, we had 2 uplinks on the building in Washington, and they had to do the orbital checkout for the third satellite, and could not use the uplink dishes in Washington for that because they were in use. So one was built in Georgia at a television uplink facility, basically to do the checkout. And then they, because I didn't realize how complicated that was, because the XM satellites had a shaped transmitter antenna that the East Coast satellite put more power on the East Coast. The West Coast satellite put more power onto the population centers on the West Coast. Sirius couldn't do that. They had to have essentially a point at the Earth antenna, because the satellite was constantly moving. But they put more, the center of the United States could see both satellites pretty regularly, and so they didn't put as much power into either one of them. But in order to check out those satellites, what they had to do is they had to have a known receiving antenna with that they knew the characteristics of, and they got those by building this receiving antenna in Georgia. And on a cloudless full moon night, you would sweep the dish across the face of the moon and look at what you were getting, because that was a known strength signal. And then when you brought the satellite in that had a contoured antenna shape, they would illuminate the satellite, and then they would use the maneuvering jets on the satellite to gradually sweep it across that receiving antenna to make sure that it was correct. And that took a long time. And so it's like, well, we can't do it, we can't do it and only operate one satellite for a length of time. So they built this thing in Georgia, and then they built a second one, and that's where the backup facilities for the XM platform, including program origination, was built in an uplink building in Georgia, which, as far as I know, is still there. That was the DR facility when I finally left.
Cool stuff.
Yeah, it
But
is.
We've all told Sirius XM to drop that damn $25 a month fee because I can't afford it, and then they come back with a $6 a month fee, and they told me forever now. So. But hey, how else are you going to get Yacht Rock, right?
Right. Well, and I'm not sure how much, I mean, if you have even one active subscription, I don't even listen either. When I'm in my car, obviously I listen to the radio, and I pay for a subscription. But at home, I have a pile of radios, and I think I have one of them that has an antenna on it, and it turns on about once a year, because it's much easier to shout at my
Hey Siri,
my speaker. Exactly. I'm not going to say her name because
my
then
phone
it will
just
do
said,
something.
what do you want?
It
And
just
so
did.
I listen to everything on the smart speaker, and you get so many additional channels because they're not bandwidth limited. So there's there's like 870s channels, and you get both both sides of the baseball games. Whereas if you're on the XM platform, you only get the home games.
It's phenomenal what's on the streaming.
I mean, the other thing that's kind of interesting is the if every car that's been bought today has a chipset in it that because it's been over a decade, I think, that they've been putting out what they call the wideband chipset, which was they decided to use the XM algorithm and everything. So the radios that were being put out were, decoded the XM waveform. And if you bought a car shortly after, maybe a few years after the merger, you could look at the side of the window and see if it said Sirius on it, it was the old Sirius chipset. But if it had Sirius XM Ready on it, it was actually an XM chipset. And they unified the channel lineups. The only reason Sirius transmitters are still there is for the cars that were built before they started making the combined receivers. But then they started making yet another receiver, an antenna, a few years ago that that they called the wideband, that sees all 25 megahertz, even though half of it is still occupied with Sirius.
Where is the carrier
waveform.
frequency? Is that L band? Where exactly is that?
Let me remember. It's S band up and L band down. It's pretty close to a microwave oven.
Okay.
And some of the new mobile phones, but they have 25 megahertz, 12.5 megahertz were Sirius, 12.5 megahertz were XM. It's still operated that way because of the Sirius only radios that still exist. But I have to guess that they've been making receivers that have a front end that can see the entire 25 megahertz. And I have to believe that every year or periodically they look and say, so, how many more of these Sirius only radios are still active? And just like the 405 line black and white broadcast standard in Great Britain, at some point they'll say, there's not enough radios left on the Sirius waveform. Just buy all the people who still own them a new radio. on the other side.
They'll let
And
the
then
phone
my
companies
guess is-
quit copper, right?
Right. And what they'll wind up doing is then they'll recover that 12.5 megahertz, blow new firmware into the receivers over the air probably, and double the occupied bandwidth. But it's got to be a slow pace because Sirius has to be gone, and XM only has to be gone, and the earliest versions of XM that didn't see the whole bandwidth have to be gone, and then they'll make use of the
This is great stuff.
full
Eric. I
25.
Appreciate it. I got one question for Jeff, and then I'm going to jump. What's the Trumpinator for?
That just happened to be a picture that because it was actually the FM converter that I was more concerned about, and I wasn't able to frame it with the Trumpinator out of it. So
I thought that was a political advertisement there.
it's not so. Yeah, and I was afraid of that too. Yeah.
Well, how else could that be interpreted?
Well, it's jeez.
A tree stump?
I don't know. I can't wait to December.
Well, you should live here.
Oh God. I am so tired of this political crap. It's not even funny.
It's going to be an interesting day.
Jeez.
Oh,
well,
God,
actually,
interesting.
There
no.
won't be any
no,
delusion
no,
that
look.
it'll be over on the first day.
Yeah,
You got your long run?
it's not going to be. Let's face it. Let's put. Look. Let's just call a spade here, okay? It's no matter which side wins, the other side's going to cry foul. All right, it's already been
Well,
designed.
they always have, but it's just unique.
yeah,
One
no,
decided to storm the Capitol. That's all.
No, look. It's nobody stormed the Capitol anyway.
Oh, no,
I was watching it. No, I was watching it that day.
That was a day of love. I take it.
Oh, jeez, never mind. I knew that was
With
going
that, with that, I'm gone.
Yeah,
Just
I'm going to leave it
remember-
alone because I live here and I saw it.
Just
It's been
remember
made,
whoever-
but both sides are now showing the tape of the absolute worst of the other side.
It's interesting though, with all the attorneys, all the attorneys that usually like to get to the bottom of things, don't get to the bottom of that. They just stay right there on the January 6th. Come on.
I'm sure that nobody wants to get to the bottom of it that bad. I mean, the thing that has amazed me about the whole thing is that that several of the lawyers didn't lawyer themselves out of being criminally convicted for things. Lawyers are usually more. I mean, Giuliani, what the hell is wrong with that guy? I mean, he was an attorney, and somehow he managed to get himself in so much paperwork with his name on it that the convictions were coming.
Look, here you go. Let me ask you a question. You're in Cuba. Cuba's a communist country. Okay. All right.
Well, yeah. Go ahead.
Okay. Can we agree with that? Okay. What now, if you come with the idea, all right, of a democratic process, how are you going to be perceived by the government?
What does that have to do with Cuba?
Cuba's,
if I would go to Cuba and say, I want you to have a democratic process.
Well, let's assume. Well, you're somebody in Cuba, okay?
Okay.
You can take
I'm trying to understand the question.
All right.
So it's communist, and I live there in Cuba. Okay.
Yeah. All right. How would you be perceived? You'd be perceived as a
criminal.
Yeah, you would. Okay.
Because you are a criminal, because they have laws in Cuba that do not allow any opposition.
That's correct. And
this country does not have those laws.
Well, I got news for you. Maybe they don't have those laws, but they like to enforce them. How there's a lot of this stuff going on here, and it's as I say, I'd rather keep this just a radio personally. I'm sorry I didn't edit that part out there with the Trumpinator.
Right. Well,
I'll do that before the next meeting. This is just a lot of fun talking.
We should have our differences, but no one should die.
Well, I got news for you.
You know, it would be
All
better.
right,
It would be
look,
better
if
if no
you
one
want
died.
to, well, okay. The media is the one that goes ahead and plays this thing as a sporting event. All right. I mean, give me a break here. All right. People are, you got millions of people that rely, all right, on Screw You America every morning. All right, with with George Stephanopoulos as the lead host on that. Tell me that's no, there's no biasing here. Give me
I don't know.
a break.
I don't watch network television anymore,
It doesn't.
and I've pretty much
Look,
given up
hold
on
on a minute.
cable as well.
Hold on a minute. Hold on. You can say that you don't, okay? Anecdotally, but you tell me how many millions of people do watch it every morning and listen and stay on every word of them. I'm sorry. It's just gotten to a point. It's gotten to a point with this. They're purposely doing this stuff. All right. It's very simple. Fear, confuse, divide, and conquer, and that's what you're seeing.
And it's coming from both sides.
It is, because both sides are playing into it. Look, it's the politics is the most dangerous game there is, and it's got the highest, without a doubt, the highest prize. You don't think that they're going to you don't think that one side or the other or both are going to